Okay, well, Iona, it's a real pleasure to meet you. You're the creator of the Young Money blog. You're
Yes.
now also on various boards in the financial industry. So would you like to talk about why you started the Young Money blog and also these new roles that you've just entered?
Sure. I started the Young Money blog in 2011. I don't have a financial or economic background, although that is in keeping with most people I come across in the industry. I started life as a musician. I trained as a classical musician, went to university and studied music, and then tried to make a living as a musician in Glasgow. And I was really struggling to do that and to become financially independent. And it was an issue that was really prevalent among my friends as well. They were all very exercised about the perceived inequality between the generations, the idea that perhaps my generation was going to be the first that was worse off than the previous generation. And I think the idea started to take root in my mind that actually young people were crying out for information and guidance and solidarity when it comes to their finances, but it wasn't there. The media is very concentrated towards an older demographic because there's a perception that it's older people who consume the media more than younger people. It's a logic that I've never bought, but it still persists in many quarters even now. And so I also needed to get better at managing my money. I had an incident where my money got stolen from a piggy bank. It was about, I don't know, £500, and it was all my earnings from gigs that I built up over a year. I was pretty devastated about it, and I realised that actually this was an area that was too important to leave to chance. It was too important to my happiness to just have as an afterthought. So I started the blog to get better with money myself, and I hope maybe I might help some other people along the way. And then there were a few years really where I did that as a side hustle, as something that wasn't even earning money. Really, I don't like to use the word passion because it's very overused, but it was certainly more of a I don't know, an interest and an outlet for me outside of my work. I was getting work in the traditional financial media. I've done all sorts of jobs, and then it was only really a few years ago when I decided to go self-employed and really actually start to make the most of the blog and see where it could go. That was when I also started seeing so much more interest in that agenda. There was an explosion in the demand for comment and insight and views about young money. And it turned out that I was pretty much the only person who was weird enough to do it. So I hopefully have stepped up to the plate. And since then, I have been asked to come into various initiatives, which I think show a big sea change in how we view young people and money. It used to be the case that lots of figures within financial services were pretty dismissive about young people being good with money. There was an assumption that it's a lost cause and that ultimately they'll only get good with it when it becomes a matter of urgency. Unfortunately, that often is too late. It's not particularly wise to be waiting until that point. But recently there's been a shift in understanding where, companies know that if they're going to get to the next generation, they've got to have more input from the consumers that they're hoping to reach. And the only way they can do that is by having greater, younger representation in the industry. So I now sit on the Pensions Policy Institute Governors Board, and I also sit on the Next Generation Pensions Committee. And already I feel there's been this great appetite to get my views. I mean, I'm just one person. I don't purport to represent all young people. That would be ludicrous. I think it just shows the need for more people to come forward and show that we are thinking and talking and worrying about money, and we want our views heard. So that's where I'm at now. I'm at a very interesting juncture in my career with it, but I'm very exercised about how to get more young people into the industry and also just better represented and better served by the industry.
And you've just won this award, which is the Ipsy Freelancer of the Year. Do you want to just talk about that and how you got it and what it means?
Yeah, it's a totally unexpected turn of events because, like I said before, I've only really been committed to self-employment in the last few years. I went through various phases of going in and out of self-employment ever since starting in financial media when I was 23. And I never had the confidence to pursue it. I never had the self-belief to really, put up with all the downsides and go and find the work and market myself in a way that could sustain that path. So going self-employed and deciding to really commit to it a few years ago was a watershed. And after that, I was forwarded a link to entering the competition by a former editor of mine. And because I respect her and anything that she says, I more or less, accept as gospel because she's got such terrific judgment. I thought, okay, I'll enter, and it's no skin off my nose. And if I don't get anywhere with it, I haven't had to pay to enter. So, why not? And I was gobsmacked to be shortlisted and completely stunned to win. And I think the reason why is this idea of me being somebody who's fairly unique and not really, there's not really anybody else who does young money issues. So I keep saying that the wonder is not that it's being done well, the wonder is it's being done at all. And therefore, they really responded to the fact that a young person was talking about young money and committing to the agenda in the way that I was.
You're very much into education, I think, financial education for young people. Now, we were talking briefly before about this, and you don't want to phrase it as education, as a kind of one-off.
I think we need to be having a debate about the word education. I think that there's a lot of there are many differing views about whether financial education works, partly because we don't have the concrete evidence as yet to show that it really works. There are isolated studies here and there, and I think that empirically and anecdotally, I hear that it has a tremendous effect in certain places where it's done well. The problem is just knowing whether its success has been replicated right across the board. So I think we have to acknowledge that financial education is not necessarily a silver bullet, and that we don't really know whether it works in all circumstances all the time. So there's that. And then there's the idea of education beyond school, because, when you talk about financial education, people have a very specific idea of it being taught in classrooms. And that's one issue. But then the other issue is financial education for older people. My generation missed out on financial education, as in it wasn't compulsory when I was at school. It is now, even though the provision's quite patchy and there's no guarantee that every child will actually receive financial education. But for my generation, education is not, I think, an appropriate word to use. We need to be looking much more at how to empower my generation, to give them information so they can make their own decisions. And education implies that there's somebody who knows best, who is telling us what to do with our money. And that approach is never going to work with millennials. I don't think that for the most part, we are wired that way and that we'll respond well to that approach.
Let me give you an example, right? So the FCA did this study recently where they asked people, what fees are you paying for your product, for your ISA, your pension? 1 in 3 people didn't know they were paying a fee. And when people come to me, it's usually because they've watched my YouTube video. A lot of them are people like, they have St. James's Place as a wealth manager. They're being charged 3.5% per year. And they suddenly realize that this is basically draining their life savings. So I think some of it is just teaching the really basic facts about fees, how to invest. That's my focus. But I think what's interesting about your approach is, and also let's kind of introduce your book now, which is Spare Change. And suddenly a graphic will now flash up of spare change with a nice piggy bank on the front. I think what's interesting about your approach is that you very much think of it as lifestyle engineering. It's not just about learning facts about how to price a bond or how to manage risk. It's about constructing a life so that your goals mesh with your finances, which I thought was just a beautiful way of describing how to approach finance.
Oh, well, thank you. I gave it an awful lot of thought because I read financial books that took the approach that you describe, and I didn't feel that it was appropriate for the readers that I wanted to attract, people who don't read books about money, people who don't think about money in the course of their everyday lives. I wanted to disrupt that and to get into people's minds in a way that wasn't going to be too intimidating and daunting. And I think the way that you do that is by going back to basics. I started with the psychology of money, the ways our brains work that can be quite difficult and can make managing money hard. And by trying to give people that self-awareness of those psychological tendencies, as well as the external commercial temptations that are there, that always conspire to make us actually quite bad with money, I wanted to really explore those in depth and open people's minds up to the ideas, and therefore give them a mentality that would make them sufficiently motivated to go and find the information that you describe, which is out there. I would never purport to be the first person to be offering that information or the best placed person to offer that information. But I feel that I have a way with words, and I have a way of really looking at the bigger picture and then communicating that to people, so that they then feel galvanized and they can go and find the information that will suit their purposes.
I've seen that the ONS has just showed that the level of saving in the UK is at an almost all-time record low. So it must be really hard to convince young people to kind of not live for the moment, but also to think about retirement, because pensions are so boring.
It's such a huge issue that we've got to try and unpack in quite a short space of time. We send out very muddled messages about saving and investing. What most people don't understand is that when they are in an occupational scheme, they are in fact investors. And I personally object to the use of the word long-term saving, because it doesn't represent what's going on. When you are invested in the stock market or bonds, you are invested. Therefore, we need to be far clearer in the language that we use with those saving into pension schemes. And we need to separate that from the actual shorter term saving that lots of people still aren't doing, despite being enrolled in workplace pensions and being, I think, really compelled to have quite complicated, opaque financial arrangements in this way. They're not even at first base with saving. And that's also because the industry has done a crap job of making saving relatable, making people understand that actually it's not about closing down your options, it's about opening them up. It's about giving you freedom and opportunity. When you have savings, that's your money. Nobody can take that away from you. And I understand that obviously when inflation is at a certain rate and interest rates are low, it can feel like there's very little reward and possibly even you're being punished for saving because you're losing money. But I think you have to take a longer term view than that. And I would never advocate that just because interest rates were at a certain rate that you shouldn't have an emergency savings pot. You shouldn't have savings that will pay for a holiday instead of debt, for instance. I would always say that is the wisest route to protecting your money. But then in the long term, obviously, the reason why I talk about investing increasingly on the blog is because I'm well aware that those rates aren't going to get you a return on your money in the long term. And besides being invested for the long term, either in a pension or a lifetime ISA or your own stocks and shares ISA, whatever it might be, so long as you are having one eye to the future in that way and making sure you're wrapping your head around these concepts to do with investing, then you're a winner.
And one of the things you talk about is when you should and shouldn't borrow. Because my grandmother always told me, Roman, neither a borrower or a lender be. So, of course, I went into a job in investment banking. And, of course, you've got to have a mortgage, right? So when do you think it's kind of a good idea and a bad idea to borrow money? And should you do it on things like holidays, for example?
It's really complicated. I think we have a very moralistic view of borrowing in this country, which for the most part, I think actually is quite a healthy corrective to what would otherwise be a damaging or consumer culture. It's hard to look at borrowing outside your own personal perspective. And on the blog, I think I always try to make it clear that I'm not an independent financial advisor, so I don't have to take this, big overview, this expert overview. And I have the luxury, I suppose, of being able to talk about my experience. And then if it connects with somebody, then great. And hopefully people can learn from it. My own personal view is I don't have a credit card because I would never trust myself. And I also don't feel like I could manage it well. When I hear about young people having these incredibly complicated arrangements with their credit cards, no wonder it goes wrong so much of the time. We just do not have the bandwidth to deal with it. And it's partly because it's so easy to take out that credit, but it's so hard to pay it back. And borrowers make it intentionally hard. When it comes to mortgages, you have already alluded to the argument I make in the book, which is that obviously there is such a thing as good debt in certain circumstances. The problem is knowing when it's good debt. I think student debt has become very contentious, and it's an area that I don't even cover that much on the blog anymore because there's so many people writing about it now, and because I'm 30 and my circumstances are going to be different from recent graduates who I feel really have been very heavily punished by the way the system's changed over time. But when it comes to mortgages, I have a mortgage, and I have always been an advocate of keeping the option of housing wealth open. I'm not one of these people who believes that young people should completely rule out getting on the housing ladder. And it's difficult whenever I'm asked to give my view in the media about it. I try to be balanced. I say, on the one hand, saving for a house it doesn't have to be the be all and end all. And you have to make a good decision about your housing. There's no point buying somewhere anywhere for the sake of it just to be on the housing ladder. It's obviously got to be the right house in the right area, and a mortgage that you'll be able to afford over the long term. But at the same time, if you do all those things and you can manage your finances so that the mortgage is affordable and that you're actually paying it off, I'm paying off my mortgage. I don't view it as some lifelong debt that is mine to keep. I want to get rid of it. And unfortunately, we do have now an attitude where a mortgage seems to just be this lifelong debt that we all accept. We need to be thinking about ways of being able to pay off that mortgage and get that monkey off our backs.
And you talk about relationships too, which I thought was great. You kind of say, okay,
Yeah.
When you first meet someone, almost at the first date, you have to say, how do you feel about finances? Or about,
yeah, I wish I could practice what I preach. I still find it difficult to have these conversations. But since doing the book, I have become so much more aware of how finances are at the foundation of relationships. And it's a taboo. No one likes to talk about it because it takes the romance out of relationships. And yet it is, as I say in the book, it is the number one predictor of divorce across all income brackets, which I find a fascinating statistic. And it does show that people enter into these romantic arrangements and end up tying up their finances with another person. And they don't actually know what that other person's attitude to money is until way further down the line, when they're enmeshed with them and potentially, have joint liabilities with them. And that's when all the problems start.
And insurance too. You talk about insurance in the book?
I do, yes. I think one of the things that I'm very much hopeful that I can do a follow-up. And I think one of the things that I would possibly slightly change is my outlook on insurance. At that time, I had a very conservative outlook, and I used to believe that, and I still believe this to a great extent, that a lot of insurance is unnecessary, and that you can be talked into buying insurance by very persuasive salesmen, and therefore you need to be very clear-eyed about why you have insurance and making sure that you are getting the best possible deal for it. And I stand by that for the most part. But I would also add that I have since developed a much greater understanding of the need to protect yourself, and that savings don't necessarily offer the only safety net. So, for instance, income protection, critical illness cover, I've gained a greater appreciation of what these products can do for you, especially if you are self-employed. Since committing to self-employment in the last few years, I realised how devastating it would be if I couldn't work anymore for a particular reason, and how much of a lifesaver an income protection or critical illness policy would be in those circumstances. So yeah, I mean, I have a perhaps slightly more measured view about insurance, but I still do believe that young people need to be very cautious when they have that, for instance, students, when they're kind of persuaded that they need to take out every type of student insurance under the sun. They're a captive market there, and they need to be very aware that that insurance is not always necessary.
Now, obviously, when you're young, you don't want to think about something like death. It's a bit of a downer.
Yeah.
Obviously, I've got grey hair, so it's more of an issue for me. But longevity matters a lot, doesn't it? And in the UK, we're getting older and older. So life expectancy for someone who's born now is over 100.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think that would affect the way young people should save and conduct themselves?
I mean, where do you begin? One of the problems I have at the moment with the pensions industry is that we're not having this conversation enough, or we are having it in very limited spheres. So, for instance, the topic of longevity only tends to crop up when we're discussing the need to have a pension. And whilst I completely accept that we're going to have to fund our retirement in one way or another, we also have to think about what retirement will mean. Because if it's not this extended period at the end of our lives, then does that mean that we may be working more into retirement? We may be working part-time, we may be self-employed. And if that's the case, then is a pension going to fit in with that new mode of working and living? Perhaps not. I'm not saying that we should, rip up the current system and try and future gaze and think of this completely new revolutionary way of managing our long-term finances. But we do need to be keeping different options open and progressing the agenda. So, I mean, that's one reason why I have been an advocate of the lifetime ISA, not because I'll defend it to the death. It's got flaws. I don't think it's a finished article. I think it needs more work. But I think as long as we have the LISA on the table, we're keeping alive this conversation about how we save and invest for our retirement and what, options people need to have. So I think as well, it's funny, the idea of having a workplace pension when you're potentially having 12, 13, 14 jobs. I've heard that being the average number of jobs that someone my age will have over the course of their life. If that's the case, then what's going to happen to that pension that they have in their first job? They're going to leave it behind. It's going to wither on the vine. Okay, maybe there'll be regulations to ensure that the charges aren't too high. But still, it's not going to be spectacular when they come to retire. And if we have lots of those pots in different places and no way of being able to bring them together, then I think that young people are going to feel very surprised and possibly quite disillusioned with the system. And we're not dealing with that properly at the moment. There's been talk about having pot follows member. That got pushed out of the way. Then we had talk about the pensions dashboard. Now there are rumours that might be scrapped. If so, then what are we going to come up with as a replacement? We need
what they have in the US is kind of interesting.
About it.
So in the US they have, sorry to interrupt, but in the US they have this thing called the 401k. So when I speak to US people, they've been investing their whole life. They're really kind of au fait with the markets. They know about the stock market. Look at the move from active to passive in the US. Much more advanced because the education about fees I think is much better over there. Whereas in the UK, we don't even know we're paying fees, right? So for a lot of us. So do you think that's an issue? Maybe we should have some kind of product that forces us to manage our own money rather than just have it siphoned off into an invisible fund that we never see again.
100%. And I think what you've talked about there is a situation that is actually quite far off in this country. And I feel very sad about that. We've given up on the idea that people can be helped, maybe not educated, I wouldn't use the word educated, but helped to manage their own money and to make the decisions that are right for them. We have adopted the religion of nudge theory now, based on this assumption made by, very, very clever economists who probably don't actually have that much experience of the real world and don't have that much experience of how young people want to behave. It's underpinned by that assumption that people don't know what's good for them. People will always default into bad habits, and therefore they need to be pushed into behavior. And they don't need that information about what their pension funds are doing or what their savings are doing, because it's irrelevant and they're not going to pay any attention even if we gave them that information. I think all of this, even if there is a grain of truth in it, is a very defeatist way of approaching the issue of our money, and it's giving up on the idea that we can ever help people become more financially savvy. And what you've described there with the situation in the US, I think it's not that dissimilar in Australia, where they have superannuated schemes and people talk about their supers around the dinner table. You know, it's a topic of conversation at dinner parties. You don't have that in this country. People don't even know they're in a workplace pension. So I think that shows just what a huge distance there is, you know, geographically and financially and culturally between different countries at the moment. But we should be looking to those countries and seeing whether there is an alternative way.
So one aspect of investing that people often forget is that when you put money into a pension, it gets siphoned off into equities and bonds, and you're actually funding arms companies, gambling companies, and maybe you're not happy with that. So what's the alternative for people who aren't comfortable with it?
Well, it's a very thorny issue, because I think if you ask most people my age whether they feel comfortable investing in arms, tobacco, gambling, pornography, etc., they'd say no. Most of them would anyway. But then if you ask them, well, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to change that? They'll probably be on the fence or say, well, I don't know how to change it. And to be fair, at the moment, there isn't a great deal of choice and information available to people who want to change their workplace pension, certainly. The only choices that are available are for those who are saving or investing privately. But if you're going through your workplace, then you get put in your default scheme, and really there is so little choice available for those who want to go beyond the default. But we also need to recognize that there are so many different definitions of moral or responsible investing, and what I consider to be SRI, you might think is not. And therefore, it is a conversation that we should be having. And I think there are issues that are much more unequivocal than others. But at the same time, I would hesitate to call, you know, certain funds 100% whiter than white, because undoubtedly you can find fault. And also we need to be thinking about it as a much broader issue. So the idea of good governance is not just restricted to SRI. It should be right across the board. I mean, I know I'm speaking as an idealist here, but it is partly my job as a young person to be idealistic, and that's the problem. We give up on trying to have at least an aspiration to have good governance, and to ensure that, for instance, the way that we are running companies. So we could have, it's funny, you could have a company that's working in arms or tobacco that actually treats its employees very well. And, you know, it does a lot itself for charity and so on. So I think that we need to be having a much more broader and mature definition of what socially responsible investing is.
Finally, Iona, I wanted to ask about what you're planning now, because I see you've set up an agency where you write content for other people.
Yes.
So maybe you'd like to just discuss that and say about what your goals are at the moment for your business.
Yes. Yeah, sure. So I set up the agency, and I call it an agency, even though at the moment it's me and my dad. So my dad is a former personal finance journalist. He retired last year. And I like to think that I am, you know, helping him as well as him helping me. I recently heard that the two most dangerous years in a person's life in terms of their health are the year that they're born and the year that they retire. So I like to think that maybe I've helped to keep my dad on the straight and narrow. We provide not only copy, but also videos, scripts, and I've been doing a bit more in the way of consultancy, even though that's not a word that I'm very keen on. I don't like calling it consultancy. What I see it as is just giving my views, what I've learned, to companies so that they can feed that back into their products and services and make them much more view friendly. And I think that we all have a tendency to dress up what we do and make it sound much more complicated and mystical than it actually is. Whereas my attitude is, well, okay, what you see is what you get. A lot of my views and my philosophy you can read on the blog. You know, sometimes I change what I think based on new evidence that comes my way. But some things I feel very strongly about and will always commit to until the day I die. And if you, as a business, think that that would be helpful to have that view factored into, you know, your strategy, then I'm here and I'm offering this. So it encompasses lots of different types of work, and I think it's great actually that I'm not just having one role anymore, and that I'm not just a journalist, I'm not just a blogger, I'm not just doing media commentary. It just keeps life so interesting, and I get to talk to so many different people, and it's great, and I'm really enjoying it.
And just to finish, I'm into classical music, so could you just talk about the musical stuff that you've been doing as well? Is that just a hobby, presumably, not professional?
Yeah, definitely. It's great. Now I get to enjoy music and do it for the fun of it. When you are trying to make music into your career, it takes all the joy out of it. So I'm just thrilled now that I can just do it for fun. I sing as part of a group called the Independent Musicians Collective, and we are doing gigs here, there, and everywhere. We've been recently established, but we have, you know, some incredible singers in the group, and we put on some really fun gigs. We recently did one which was Pride themed, so we had, you know, songs by George Michael and the Spice Girls and everything. It was so much fun. So we'll be doing more gigs, and please keep a lookout for those. I also play in an orchestra. I still do classical music. I play in Fulham Symphony Orchestra, and I play the piano whenever I get the opportunity as well. So I like to keep lots of different musical streams going.
That's great. Anyway, thank you for your time, Iona. That's been fantastic, and love the book. I think that was great. Not from my age group, obviously, but I just thought it was great. So thank you for your time, and I hope the book does really well.
Thank you very much.
I hope you found that video useful. If you did, then consider supporting us on Patreon, because for just $5 a month, you can ensure that we carry on creating this content, which many of you tell me you do find useful. So let me thank the Patreon sponsors which we currently have: Hugh Valentine, Alex Kemp, Gintautas Gerolitis, Louis Mayer, Corn Dutois, and Robert Guerrara. So just click on the buttons above to support us on Patreon, or to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Thank you for listening.